Jacob Thompson had always been different from the other kids in his small Ohio town. While most teenagers spent their weekends playing video games or hanging out at the local diner, Jacob was happiest with a sketchpad in his hands and a paintbrush tucked behind his ear. His room was a kaleidoscope of colors, filled with half-finished canvases, jars of dried-up paint, and scraps of paper covered in doodles. To him, art wasn't just a hobby, it was a way of seeing the world. He believed that every blank surface held the potential to tell a story, and he wanted to be the one to bring those stories to life. Growing up in a quiet, predictable town made Jacob crave adventure. He often dreamed of traveling to faraway places where history felt alive and culture buzzed through the air. Europe, with its cobblestone streets, towering cathedrals, and centuries-old traditions, seemed like the perfect place to spark his creativity. For years, he saved every penny from odd jobs, mowing lawns, washing cars, even painting fences, to fund his dream trip. Finally, at 24 years old, Jacob boarded a plane for the first time, his heart racing with excitement as the wheels lifted off the ground. London was the crown jewel of his itinerary. The city's mix of ancient landmarks and modern energy fascinated him. As soon as he stepped off the train at King's Cross Station, Jacob could feel the pulse of the bustling metropolis around him. Double-decker buses roared past, street performers entertained crowds, and the smell of fresh pastries wafted through the air. But nothing captured his imagination quite like Buckingham Palace. Standing before the grand building, Jacob couldn't help but marvel at its golden gates, sweeping gardens, and the iconic guards stationed outside. The royal guards were unlike anything Jacob had ever seen. Dressed in bright red coats and tall bearskin hats, they stood perfectly still, their faces expressionless. Tourists gathered around them, snapping photos and giggling as they tried to make the guards crack a smile. Jacob watched in awe, struck by the contrast between the lively crowd and the silent, statuesque figures. There was something mesmerizing about their discipline, their unwavering commitment to tradition. They seemed almost untouchable, like relics from another era frozen in time. As Jacob sketched the scene in his notebook, an idea began to form in his mind. He admired the guards' dedication, but part of him wondered what it would take to break through that impenetrable shell. What if he could add a splash of color to their rigid world? It started as a fleeting thought, a playful notion that tickled the edges of his brain. But the more he stared at the guards, the more the idea took hold. Jacob had always believed that art should challenge people, make them think, and push boundaries. And standing there, surrounded by history and tradition, he felt an irresistible urge to do something bold, something unforgettable. Little did Jacob know, the decision he was about to make would change his life forever. As Jacob stood among the crowd of tourists, snapping pictures and laughing near the royal guards, his mind raced with thoughts. He couldn't shake the image of those crimson uniforms and stoic faces from his head. To him, they weren't just soldiers standing guard. They were symbols of something much bigger: tradition, order, and an unchanging way of life. But to Jacob, who lived for spontaneity and self-expression, that rigidity felt suffocating. It was like staring at a locked door when all he wanted to do was fling it open. Jacob's fingers twitched as he clutched his sketchbook. He had always believed that art should challenge people, make them question what they thought they knew. A blank canvas wasn't just a surface to fill, it was a space to explore ideas, push limits, and start conversations. And now, looking at the guards, he saw them not as humans, but as living statues, waiting to be transformed. The idea that had started as a playful thought earlier began to grow louder in his mind. What if he could turn one of these silent figures into a work of art? What if he could force people to see them differently? The notion excited him. For years, Jacob had struggled to find ways to stand out as an artist. Back home, his work often went unnoticed, dismissed as too weird or not serious enough. But here, in front of Buckingham Palace, surrounded by history and thousands of tourists, he felt like he finally had a chance to create something unforgettable. Something that would grab attention, spark debate, and maybe even make headlines. His heart pounded as he imagined the shock on people's faces, the flurry of cameras capturing the moment, the world talking about him. But deep down there was also a voice of doubt. Was this reckless? Dangerous even? Jacob pushed it aside. After all, he told himself, this wasn't vandalism. It was performance art. Artists throughout history had broken rules to make statements, hadn't they? Picasso, Warhol, Banksy, they'd all challenged norms and provoked reactions. Why shouldn't he? Besides, how much trouble could he really get into? It was just paint, right? With growing determination, Jacob wandered away from the main group of tourists and ducked into a nearby art supply store. He browsed the shelves, his eyes scanning bottles of acrylics in every color imaginable. Blue caught his eye. It was bold, striking, impossible to ignore. Perfect. He bought a large bottle, ignoring the puzzled look the cashier gave him as he handed over his money. By the time he stepped back outside, the weight of the paint in his bag made his pulse quicken. This was really happening. Walking back toward the palace, Jacob rehearsed the scene in his head. He'd approach casually, pour the paint quickly, and let the chaos unfold. The simplicity of the plan gave him confidence. No one would expect it. No one would stop him before it was too late. As he neared the guards again, his palms grew sweaty, and his breath came faster. Tourists milled around, oblivious to the storm brewing inside him. Security officers stood nearby, chatting idly. Everything seemed normal. But Jacob knew that within moments, nothing would be. He hesitated for a split second, glancing around to ensure no one was watching him too closely. Then, gripping the bottle tightly, he took a step forward. His mind buzzed with adrenaline, drowning out any lingering doubts. This was his moment, his chance to leave a mark, not just on the guard's uniform, but on the world. Without another thought, Jacob moved closer, ready to act. Jacob's heart was pounding so loudly, he could barely hear the chatter of the tourists around him. The bottle of blue paint felt heavy in his hand as he took one last step toward the guard. This was it, the moment he had been building up to in his mind for hours. His fingers trembled slightly, but he steadied himself. He told himself this wasn't just an act of rebellion. It was art. Bold, daring, unforgettable art. With a deep breath, Jacob uncapped the bottle and tipped it forward. The bright blue liquid spilled out in a thick stream, splashing across the guard's pristine red coat. For a split second, everything seemed to freeze. The crowd gasped in unison, their cheerful murmurs turning into stunned silence. Cameras that had been aimed at the guards suddenly swung toward Jacob, capturing every detail of the shocking scene. Tourists who moments ago had been laughing and posing for photos now stared wide-eyed, some covering their mouths in disbelief. A child nearby started crying, confused by the sudden tension in the air. The guard didn't move. Not a muscle twitched. His face remained completely expressionless, as if nothing had happened. Jacob felt a strange mix of awe and unease at the man's unwavering discipline. It was almost surreal, like pouring paint onto a statue instead of a human being. But reality came crashing back quickly. Security officers, who had been casually standing nearby, sprang into action. Shouts erupted from all directions as they rushed toward Jacob, their voices sharp and commanding. "Stop right there," one officer barked, his tone leaving no room for argument. Jacob froze, the empty bottle still clutched in his hand. Panic surged through him as he realized the enormity of what he'd just done. The crowd, once curious observers, now turned hostile. People began yelling insults, their words cutting through the chaos like knives. "What's wrong with you? Do you have any respect? That's disgusting." Some tourists even raised their fists angrily, though they stayed far enough away not to interfere. Jacob wanted to explain himself, to tell them this wasn't vandalism, but an artistic statement. But the words caught in his throat. All he could do was stand there, pale and shaking, as the officers closed in on him. Within seconds, Two security guards grabbed him firmly by the arms, yanking the bottle from his grip. They dragged him backward, away from the scene, while another called for backup over a radio. Jacob stumbled slightly, his legs weak beneath him. The world seemed to spin as flashes of cameras blinded him, capturing his humiliation for the entire world to see. Someone shouted, "You're going to jail for this." Another voice yelled, "Good riddance." As Jacob was hauled off, he glanced back at the guard one last time. The blue paint dripped slowly down the man's uniform, marring its perfect symmetry. To Jacob, it looked surreal, a splash of modernity against centuries of tradition. But he no longer felt excitement or pride. Instead, a sinking feeling settled in his chest. What had he done? The cold, sterile walls of the police station felt like a world away from the grandeur of Buckingham Palace. Jacob sat on a hard wooden bench in a small holding cell, his hands trembling as he replayed the events over and over in his mind. How had it all gone so wrong? What had seemed like a clever idea just hours ago now felt like the stupidest thing he'd ever done. He buried his face in his hands, trying to block out the sounds of officers talking nearby and the clanging of metal doors echoing down the hallway. For the first time, Jacob allowed himself to think about the consequences. Back home, people often joked about getting arrested for silly things, like streaking at a football game or accidentally setting off a fire alarm. But this was different. This wasn't some harmless prank. It was an attack on tradition, on authority, on something much bigger than himself. As the weight of his actions settled over him, Jacob realized he might not just get a slap on the wrist. His stomach churned with dread. A stern-looking officer approached the cell, holding a clipboard. "Jacob Thompson?" he asked, though it wasn't really a question. Without waiting for an answer, he unlocked the door and gestured for Jacob to follow. The walk to the interrogation room felt endless, each step heavier than the last. Inside, another officer waited, her expression unreadable as she flipped open a file folder filled with papers. "Do you understand the seriousness of what you've done?" she asked, her voice calm but firm. Jacob nodded slowly, unable to meet her eyes. She explained that damaging the uniform of a royal guard wasn't just vandalism. It was considered a grave offense under British law. Not only had he disrespected the monarchy, but he'd also disrupted public order and caused distress to countless tourists. The penalties could include hefty fines, community service, or even imprisonment. As if that wasn't enough, the officer added, "This is already all over the news." Jacob's heart sank further. News outlets around the world had picked up the story within minutes of the incident. Video clips of him pouring paint on the guard were everywhere. Social media feeds, television broadcasts, online forums. People were calling him names he didn't even recognize, labeling him as reckless, disrespectful, and selfish. Some commenters called for harsh punishments, while others mocked his attempt to pass off the act as art. Back home in Ohio, the backlash hit even harder. Jacob's parents received frantic phone calls from neighbors and relatives asking if their son was really the man they saw on TV. Reporters showed up at their doorstep, shoving microphones in their faces and demanding statements. His mother broke down in tears during one interview, saying she didn't recognize the person her son had become. Friends who once admired Jacob's creativity began distancing themselves, deleting photos of him from social media and avoiding his family altogether. Meanwhile, opportunities Jacob had worked so hard for started slipping through his fingers. Galleries that had planned to showcase his work canceled exhibitions without explanation. A local art supply store where he occasionally gave workshops terminated its partnership with him. Even potential employers who had shown interest in hiring him suddenly ghosted after seeing his name splashed across headlines. It was as if the vibrant future he imagined for himself had been erased in an instant, all because of one impulsive decision. Sitting in that interrogation room, Jacob felt utterly alone. For the first time in his life, his passion for art hadn't brought him closer to people, it had pushed them away. And as the reality of his ruined reputation set in, He couldn't help but wonder if there was any way to fix what he'd broken. The courtroom was packed, buzzing with whispers and camera clicks as Jacob sat slumped in his chair. Reporters jostled for the best seats, their pens poised to capture every detail of the trial. Tourists who had witnessed the incident weeks earlier now lined up outside, eager to see the man behind the headlines in person. Jacob felt like he was on display once again. But this time, there was no artistic intent, no statement to make. He was just a defendant, staring down the barrel of consequences far greater than he'd ever imagined. As the judge entered the room, the chatter died down, replaced by an oppressive silence. Jacob swallowed hard, his throat dry. The prosecution wasted no time painting him as reckless and disrespectful. This wasn't art, it was an attack, the lawyer declared, his voice booming across the courtroom. Mr. Thompson deliberately defaced a symbol of our nation's heritage, causing chaos and distress to innocent bystanders. His actions were selfish, thoughtless, and unacceptable. Jacob listened, his face burning with shame. Every word stung, not because it was untrue, but because it was exactly how he'd come to see himself. The defense tried to argue that Jacob's intentions weren't malicious, that he truly believed he was making a creative statement about tradition versus modernity. But the judge didn't seem moved. To the court, his act looked less like art and more like rebellion without purpose. When it was Jacob's turn to speak, he stood nervously, gripping the edge of the podium for support. His voice wavered as he began to explain his side. "I never meant to hurt anyone or disrespect the guards," he said, looking directly at the judge. "I thought I was creating something meaningful, something that would make people think differently about tradition. But I realize now that I went too far. I made a mistake, a huge one, and I'm sorry." His apology sounded hollow even to his own ears. The crowd remained silent, unmoved by his words. Outside, journalists scribbled furiously in their notebooks, capturing every faltering syllable. Social media lit up instantly, with commenters mocking his attempt to justify himself. "Sorry doesn't fix what he did," one post read. Another simply said, "Good riddance." After hours of deliberation, the verdict came: guilty. Jacob was sentenced to 6 months in jail and ordered to pay restitution for the damaged uniform. The judge's tone was stern as she delivered the ruling. "Your actions have consequences, Mr. Thompson," she said. "You've tarnished not only your own reputation, but also the dignity of those you claim to admire. I hope this serves as a lesson to you and others who might consider similar acts." As the gavel struck, sealing his fate, Jacob felt a wave of despair wash over him. Cameras flashed wildly as officers led him out of the courtroom, reporters shouting questions he couldn't bring himself to answer. Back in his cell later that evening, he stared at the cracked ceiling, replaying the day's events in his mind. It wasn't just the sentence that weighed heavily on him. It was the realization that he'd become a cautionary tale, a name synonymous with recklessness and disrespect. But amidst the guilt and regret, a small flicker of determination began to grow. If this was his lowest point, then maybe it could also be the start of something new. Jacob resolved to use his time in jail wisely, not to dwell on his mistakes, but to figure out how to learn from them. For the first time since the incident, he allowed himself to believe that redemption might still be possible. Life behind bars was a far cry from the freedom Jacob had once taken for granted. The days stretched endlessly, marked only by the clanging of cell doors and the monotonous routine of meals, chores, and brief periods of outdoor exercise. At first, Jacob struggled to adjust. The cold concrete walls and the constant noise of shouting inmates made it hard to think clearly. But as the weeks passed, he began to find small ways to cope, withdrawing into himself, sketching on scraps of paper torn from notebooks provided by the prison library, and reflecting deeply on the choices that had brought him here. One day, during a rare moment of quiet, an older inmate named Marcus approached Jacob in the recreation yard. Marcus had been inside for years and had earned a reputation as someone who could read people well. He noticed Jacob's habit of scribbling furiously whenever he got a chance. "You're good at that," Marcus said, nodding toward the sketches scattered across Jacob's lap. "What's your story?" Jacob hesitated before answering. He didn't want to relive the humiliation of his past actions, but something about Marcus's calm demeanor put him at ease. Slowly, he began to open up, about his love for art, his reckless decision at Buckingham Palace, and the avalanche of consequences that followed. To his surprise, Marcus didn't laugh or judge him. Instead, he listened intently, nodding occasionally as if piecing together a puzzle. "You know," Marcus said after a long pause, "everybody messes up. What matters is what you do next. You've got talent, that much is clear. Use it to tell the truth, not just your side of things, but how you feel about what happened. People respect honesty." Marcus's words stuck with Jacob long after their conversation ended. For the first time since his arrest, he felt a spark of purpose. Maybe his art didn't have to be about rebellion or shock value anymore. Maybe it could be about connection, about sharing his regrets, his growth, and his hope for redemption. With renewed determination, Jacob began creating pieces inspired by his experiences. Stark charcoal drawings of towering palace gates juxtaposed against splashes of chaotic color. Portraits of faceless guards standing rigid against swirling backdrops of emotion. And even self-portraits showing himself trapped within the confines of his own mistakes. Then came the letter that changed everything. It arrived one morning, slipped under his cell door along with other mail. The envelope bore no return address, but the handwriting was neat and deliberate. Inside was a short note written in careful cursive. "Dear Mr. Thompson, I am the mother of the guard whose uniform you ruined. While what you did caused my son great distress, I believe everyone deserves forgiveness. Your apology meant something to me, and I hope you can use this experience to grow. Art has the power to heal, not just for others, but for yourself." Jacob read the letter over and over, tears blurring the words. He hadn't expected kindness from anyone connected to his crime, let alone the family of the person most directly affected. The gesture touched him deeply, reigniting his passion for using art as a force for good rather than destruction. He realized then that while he couldn't undo what he'd done, he could channel his remorse into something meaningful, something that might help others understand the importance of accountability and second chances. By the time Jacob completed his sentence, he had filled several sketchbooks with raw emotional work. Each piece told a chapter of his journey, from the arrogance of his early days in London to the shame of his trial and the slow process of rebuilding his sense of self-worth. As he walked out of the prison gates on his final day, Jacob carried more than just his belongings. He carried a newfound clarity about who he was and what he wanted to say to the world. And for the first time in months, he allowed himself to believe that his story wasn't over. It was just beginning. Stepping back into the world outside prison walls was both exhilarating and terrifying for Jacob. The sunlight felt warmer, the air fresher, but the weight of his past actions still lingered like a shadow he couldn't shake. He returned to his small Ohio town, where whispers followed him wherever he went. Some people avoided him altogether, while others stared openly, their expressions a mix of curiosity and judgment. But Jacob refused to let the negativity consume him. Instead, he focused on rebuilding, not just his life, but his reputation. With the support of a local community center, Jacob secured a small gallery space for an exhibition. It was risky. He knew many people in town still saw him as the vandal from London. But this wasn't about proving them wrong. It was about sharing his truth. He titled the show Colors of Contrition, a collection of paintings, sketches, and mixed media pieces that chronicled his journey from arrogance to accountability. Each artwork told a story. The bright red coats of the royal guards clashed with chaotic streaks of blue, symbolizing the moment his life unraveled. Somber portraits depicted inmates he'd met in jail, their faces etched with quiet resilience, and abstract pieces explored themes of forgiveness, growth, and redemption. On opening night, Jacob stood nervously by the entrance, bracing himself for rejection. To his surprise, however, people came, more than he expected. Some were friends who had drifted away after his arrest, but were curious to see how he'd changed. Others were strangers drawn by news of the controversial artist returning home. As visitors moved through the gallery, their initial skepticism gave way to thoughtful silence. Many paused in front of a large centerpiece painting titled "The Guard's Forgiveness." It depicted a lone guard standing against a backdrop of swirling blues and grays, his face obscured but his posture calm and dignified. Beneath it hung the letter from the guard's mother, framed and displayed with her permission. Critics were divided at first. Some dismissed the exhibit as self-indulgent, accusing Jacob of trying to justify his reckless behavior. But others praised its raw honesty and emotional depth. One reviewer wrote, "Thompson doesn't shy away from his mistakes. He confronts them head-on, using his art to explore universal themes of regret and transformation. This isn't just an apology. It's a conversation starter." Slowly, word spread beyond the town. Local newspapers covered the exhibition, then regional ones, and eventually national outlets picked up the story. What had started as a humble display in a small-town gallery became a topic of discussion across the country. As the weeks passed, something remarkable happened. People began reaching out to Jacob, not to criticize him, but to thank him. A teacher wrote to say she brought her students to see the exhibit, using it as a lesson about taking responsibility for one's actions. An ex-convict shared how Jacob's work reminded him of his own struggles with guilt and redemption. Even the guard whose uniform he'd ruined sent a message, saying he appreciated the sincerity of Jacob's efforts to make amends. These responses humbled Jacob and reinforced his belief in the power of art to heal and connect. By the time the exhibition closed, Jacob felt like a different person. He no longer saw himself as the reckless young man who had poured paint on a royal guard or the disgraced figure dragged through headlines. Instead, he saw himself as someone who had fallen hard but gotten back up and used his pain to create something meaningful. For the first time in years, Jacob felt hopeful about the future. His journey wasn't perfect, and scars remained, but they were reminders not of failure, but of growth. And that, he realized, was worth celebrating. Years after the incident at Buckingham Palace, Jacob Thompson was no longer defined by the reckless act that had once made headlines. He had transformed himself, not just as an artist, but as a person. His name was still associated with the infamous paint-pouring stunt, but now it carried a different meaning. Where people once saw arrogance and disrespect, they began to see resilience and redemption. Jacob had turned his lowest moment into a foundation for something greater, a legacy of learning from mistakes and using creativity to inspire others. He became a sought-after speaker, invited to schools, universities, and conferences to share his story. Standing before audiences, Jacob didn't shy away from recounting the details of that fateful day in London. He described the rush of adrenaline, the deafening silence of the crowd, and the crushing realization of what he'd done wrong. But he also spoke candidly about the lessons he learned, about accountability, humility, and the importance of thinking before acting. "I thought I was making a statement," he often said, "but instead I created chaos. My actions hurt real people, and there's no excuse for that. What I've tried to do since is turn my failure into a lesson, one I hope can help others avoid the same mistakes." Jacob's speeches resonated deeply, especially with young artists who admired his work but struggled with their own fears of failure. He encouraged them to push boundaries in their art, but always with respect and responsibility. Creativity should challenge people, not harm them, he emphasized. There's a difference between sparking conversation and causing pain. Find your voice without silencing someone else's. His artwork continued to evolve too. While Colors of Contrition marked the beginning of his journey toward redemption, subsequent exhibitions explored broader themes of human connection, forgiveness, and second chances. One series, titled Threads of Repair, featured large-scale tapestries woven with fragmented images of broken objects being mended. Another, called Echoes of Apology, used sound installations to immerse viewers in the emotional weight of saying sorry and truly meaning it. Each project was met with growing acclaim, solidifying Jacob's reputation as an artist who used his craft to foster understanding rather than division. Despite his success, Jacob never forgot where he came from or how close he'd come to losing everything. He stayed grounded by volunteering at community centers, teaching free art classes to kids who reminded him of his younger self, restless, passionate, and eager to leave their mark on the world. He told them stories of his missteps, not to glorify his past, but to show them that even the biggest failures could lead to growth if approached with honesty and effort. Today, when people mention Jacob Thompson, they don't just think of the man who poured paint on a royal guard. They think of the artist who dared to confront his flaws and use them to create beauty. They think of the speaker who inspired classrooms full of students to dream boldly but act responsibly. And they think of the person who proved that while we can't erase our mistakes, we can rewrite their meaning. For Jacob, life wasn't perfect. He still faced moments of doubt and reminders of his past, but he had found peace in knowing he'd turned his downfall into something meaningful. Every brushstroke, every speech, every interaction was a testament to his belief that redemption wasn't about erasing scars. It was about wearing them proudly as proof of survival. In the end, Jacob's story wasn't just about ruining his life. It was about rebuilding it, one thoughtful choice at a time.